What would you do if everything you thought you knew about the person closest to you was a lie? What if, hours after the death of your loved one, you uncovered something so shocking, so unexpected, that it shook you to your core? For Grace James, that's exactly what happened. Today, we're going to walk you through the story of Mason Lucas, a man whose life, love, and death would all reveal the unthinkable truth hidden in plain sight. Mason Lucas wasn't just any man. He was the kind of person who would do anything for his family. He was hardworking, dependable, and generous to a fault. Growing up, Mason had always been the one to step up when things got tough. When his father passed away when he was just a teenager, Mason put aside his dreams and stepped into the role of the man of the house. College plans? Postponed. His mother, his two younger brothers, they all depended on him, and he didn't hesitate for a second. Even after starting his own family, Mason never changed. He worked tirelessly to provide for his wife, Sophia, and their two kids. Even as his health began to suffer from the stress of balancing so many responsibilities, Mason kept pushing forward, trying to make sure everyone else was taken care of. But as much as Mason loved his family, his body began to break down. The late nights at work, the pressure of bills piling up, and the constant worry about his wife's growing demands, things were starting to take a toll. He was battling high blood pressure, exhaustion, and deep stress, but he kept it hidden, kept pushing through. He couldn't let anyone down. On the surface, Mason's relationship with his wife, Sophia Kelvin, looked perfect. They had been married for years, raised kids together, and always appeared like a model family. But, like so many things, what looked like a solid partnership wasn't what it seemed. Sophia had always been a bit high maintenance. It wasn't that she didn't care for Mason, but there was an unspoken tension between them. She was frustrated with their financial situation, constantly asking for more. More attention. More money. More luxuries. And as Mason's health declined, it seemed to only grow worse. Sophia, who had once worked, was now fully dependent on Mason's paycheck, yet nothing was ever enough. Mason, who had always given so much of himself, found it harder and harder to meet her needs. And instead of understanding, Sophia grew increasingly distant, focused more on what she could get rather than the man who was slowly breaking under the weight of it all. He was struggling and Sophia didn't seem to notice or care. Mason's sudden collapse came without warning. One moment, he was sitting at his desk, going over numbers for his repair shop, pushing through another exhausting day. The next, everything changed in an instant. He slumped over, clutching his chest, the world spinning around him. His heart, which had been fighting for so long under the weight of stress, finally gave way. The office staff rushed to his side, calling for an ambulance. Mason was rushed to the hospital, barely clinging to life. His colleagues, shocked and shaken, tried to keep hope alive, but everyone knew deep down that something was terribly wrong. The doctors did everything they could, but despite their efforts, after hours of waiting, Mason was pronounced dead. It was a devastating blow. A man who had always been there for everyone, who put in the work day in and day out, was gone. But what happened next was almost as shocking as his sudden death itself. Sophia, his wife, had been notified almost immediately, but her response was anything but what anyone expected. She didn't rush to the hospital. She didn't break down in tears, consumed by grief. No, she arrived late hours after Mason was declared dead. When she finally walked into that hospital room, her face was blank. There was no sign of the devastation that should have been there. Instead of collapsing into the arms of a loved one, or at the very least showing some visible sign of sorrow, Sophia casually walked in, as though it was just another errand to run. She made small talk with the hospital staff, almost like she was in a rush, distracted by something else. People around her were shocked. She didn't seem like someone who had just lost her husband. But the strangest part? She wasn't even calling Mason's family. His mother, his brothers, his friends, they should have been her first priority. But she didn't reach out to any of them. Instead, she was texting. Yes, texting. Her phone was almost permanently glued to her hand, as if she was more interested in some ongoing conversation than processing the reality of her husband's death. It wasn't just that she was distracted, it was the content of her messages. Sophia was smiling, laughing, chatting with someone who wasn't Mason. While her husband's body lay in the room just a few feet away, Sophia seemed more focused on texting someone than mourning the man who had given everything for her and their family. To those who were around her, it felt wrong. Deeply wrong. It wasn't just the lack of emotion, it was the way she acted, almost as if she had already moved on. As if Mason's death had already been processed, or perhaps it never really impacted her. Sophia wasn't planning the funeral, or comforting her children, or seeking support from Mason's family. Instead, she was busy with something else, something that seemed far more pressing. She made all the funeral arrangements herself. It wasn't the actions of a grieving widow, at least not one anyone would expect. Instead of letting others handle the heavy lifting in such a tough time, Sophia seemed determined to control every detail herself. This behavior didn't sit well with Mason's family. His brother, Ryan, who had always been close to him, found it odd that she hadn't reached out to him first. It wasn't like Sophia to act this way. Ryan felt uneasy, sensing that something wasn't right, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it just yet. For Grace, Mason's sister, it was worse. She stood in the background, quietly observing Sophia's every move. She couldn't understand how someone could behave like this in the face of such a loss. Grace felt it in her gut. There was something off, something out of place. But no one knew yet what Sophia was hiding, no one except, perhaps, Sophia herself. The shock of Mason's death was still fresh, but already, questions were beginning to form. Why was Sophia so cold? Why was she acting like the death of her husband didn't affect her? These questions would only grow louder in the days that followed, as the truth about Sophia's behavior began to unfold in unexpected and unsettling ways. And what Grace would discover in the days to come would turn the entire family's world upside down. Grace James had always been there for her brother, Mason. From the time they were kids, through the highs and lows of life, she'd been his rock. She had watched him work tirelessly, always putting family first, always doing whatever it took to make sure everyone else was okay. But over the last few years, Grace had noticed a change in Mason. His health had been deteriorating, his stress levels growing, and no one knew the weight he was carrying more than she did. He'd confided in her about the struggles he was facing, his increasing exhaustion, the tension at home with Sophia, and the mounting financial pressures that kept him up at night. Grace knew something was wrong, but Mason always brushed it off. He didn't want anyone to worry. That was Mason, strong, dependable, always the one holding everything together. But after his sudden collapse at work and his tragic passing, Grace's heart ached for him in a way words couldn't express. She wanted to believe it was just a heart attack, brought on by years of stress and overwork. But something about Sophia's behavior, her coldness, didn't sit right with Grace. Sophia's complete lack of emotion had disturbed her from the start. There was no crying, no wailing, no real sign of grief or loss. It was like she had already moved on, or maybe she never felt the loss at all. When Grace saw how quickly Sophia had taken control of the funeral arrangements and was so preoccupied with something else, her suspicions began to grow. Sophia's indifference to the death of her husband raised a flag. Grace couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She knew Sophia wasn't perfect, but this was something else. And so, Grace decided to investigate. She couldn't just let it go. It wasn't like her to ignore the gut feeling that told her something was wrong. She loved Mason too much to let whatever was happening behind the scenes stay hidden. She needed answers, and she was determined to find them. Grace had always been close to Mason, and she knew his routines. She knew where he kept things, where he stored his personal files, and where he hid his most private belongings. She started small, going through his desk at the office first, looking for anything that could explain the growing distance between Mason and Sophia. What she found first were old medical records, some bills from a hospital visit Mason had never mentioned, and receipts for treatments that seemed like they might have been connected to his declining health. But that didn't explain Sophia's behavior. What Grace needed was something more, something concrete that would give her a clear picture of what was really going on. After a few days, Grace moved on to Mason's personal belongings at the house. She carefully searched through his drawers, trying not to disturb anything. She didn't want Sophia to catch on to what she was doing, but Grace couldn't help herself. As she sifted through the piles of paperwork, she found a hidden folder, one that Mason hadn't shown anyone. Inside were photos, text messages, and emails. At first, she couldn't believe her eyes. The photos showed Mason's wife, Sophia, and another man, Ryan Blake. Ryan had been someone she knew vaguely, but he'd always seemed like just another acquaintance. But what she was seeing here was undeniable: Sophia had been having an affair. Grace's heart sank as she scrolled through the messages. Texts that were loving, flirtatious, and filled with intimate conversations between Sophia and Ryan. There were pictures, some of them too explicit to ignore, and dates that lined up with times Mason had been at work, out of town, or too sick to be home. Grace's head spun with disbelief. She couldn't understand it. Why would Sophia do this to Mason? Why would she betray him like this when he had been nothing but devoted? But it didn't stop there. Grace wasn't finished yet. As she kept going through the folder, she found financial record statements from Mason's bank accounts. Her eyes narrowed as she saw what she hadn't expected: huge withdrawals. Large sums of money, taken out over the last few months, often in the middle of the night, transferred into accounts that didn't belong to Mason. In total, it was tens of thousands of dollars. It hit Grace like a ton of bricks. Sophia hadn't just been unfaithful, she had been stealing from her husband. For months, Sophia had been draining his bank accounts, quietly siphoning off money while Mason worked himself to the bone, trying to keep everything together. Grace could hardly breathe as she processed the weight of what she was looking at. The betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was financial, too. At that moment, everything clicked into place. Mason's declining health, his exhaustion, the mounting stress. It wasn't just about the pressures of work. He had been trapped, trying to provide for a family that was draining him both emotionally and financially. And Sophia had been the cause of it all, hiding her affair and her theft behind the very marriage she had promised to honor. Grace sat there, staring at the evidence. She didn't know what to do next. How could she confront Sophia with this? How could she explain that the woman who had been her sister-in-law had lied, stolen, and betrayed the man who had given everything for her? But Grace knew one thing for sure: she couldn't keep this to herself. The truth had to come out, no matter how painful it would be for Mason's family. As Grace sat there, holding the files in her hands, she could feel her anger rising. Not just for the betrayal of Mason, but for the way Sophia had so easily moved on from his death, as if it had never mattered to her. Grace knew she couldn't let Sophia get away with it. The truth would come out, and it would come crashing down on her, because Mason deserved justice, and Grace would make sure she got it. Grace James couldn't hold it in any longer. She had uncovered the truth, every painful, damning detail, and now it was time to confront the woman who had betrayed her brother in every conceivable way. Every instinct told her to remain calm, to take a step back and think about how to approach this. But in that moment, the weight of everything, the lies, the infidelity, the theft, was unbearable. Her brother, Mason, had given his all, sacrificed his health, his happiness, his life for a woman who never truly cared about him. She walked to Sophia's house, her heart pounding in her chest. Every step was heavy, every thought focused on the confrontation that awaited. As she rang the doorbell, Grace's mind raced. What could she possibly say that would make Sophia understand the depth of her betrayal? Sophia opened the door, her expression pleasant, almost too pleasant. It was as if she hadn't just lost her husband only days ago, as if she wasn't about to be held accountable for the destruction she'd caused. Grace could already feel the coldness radiating from her. Sophia's lack of grief was like a slap to the face. "Grace," Sophia said, offering a smile that felt forced, even fake. "What brings you by?" Grace didn't mince words. We need to talk, she said, her voice steady but sharp. Sophia's smile faltered for a split second, then she recovered, clearly trying to mask whatever discomfort the confrontation was stirring in her. Sure. Come on in. As soon as Grace stepped inside, she didn't wait for pleasantries. She pulled out the folder she had been holding onto, the one that contained the messages, the photos, the bank statements, the evidence of everything Sophia had been hiding. She slammed it down on the coffee table, watching Sophia's face change from calm to a flicker of something unreadable. I know everything, Sophia, Grace said, her words coming out in a controlled rush. The affair. The money. The lies. How long did you think you could keep this from me? From Mason's family? Sophia's eyes narrowed, but she didn't flinch. She sat back, her posture almost too relaxed, as if this was all just another conversation to her. I don't know what you're talking about, she replied, her tone nonchalant. I don't need to explain myself to you. Grace felt her blood boil. The nerve of this woman. She had betrayed Mason in every way possible, and now she was acting as if Grace was the one overreacting. Don't play dumb, Grace shot back. I found your messages. I found the photos. I saw everything. You were stealing from him. You were using him while you ran around with another man. Sophia leaned forward slightly, but there was no hint of guilt in her eyes. If anything, there was a cold, calculating glint there. Mason was too weak to understand what I needed, she said, shrugging, as if the words meant nothing. He was never there for me. He couldn't even take care of himself. How could he take care of me? Grace's heart twisted at the utter lack of remorse. He worked himself to death for you, Sophia. He gave everything he had, his health, his time, his money. And this is how you repay him? With lies, betrayal, and stealing from him? Sophia's face remained unreadable. He didn't care about what I needed. He was always too busy with his work, too busy trying to fix everyone else's problems, too busy to be a good husband. I needed more than what he could give me. Her voice had an edge now, almost defensive, as if she was convincing herself more than Grace. The anger within Grace exploded. She took a step forward, leaning over the table, her voice rising. So, you thought that cheating on him, lying to him, and emptying his bank accounts would solve everything? You think that was the answer? Sophia leaned back, almost smugly. Mason wasn't perfect. He wasn't some saint. He wasn't supportive enough. He didn't give me the life I deserved. And you know what? He didn't even try. He let himself get sick, let himself fall apart. I couldn't sit around waiting for him to figure it out. She spoke with such calmness, as if she were justifying her actions. Grace's breath caught in her chest. The coldness in Sophia's words cut deeper than anything Grace had expected. It wasn't just that Sophia had been unfaithful, it was that she felt entitled to every single thing Mason had worked for, as if it had been her right all along. And you think this is all Mason's fault? Grace demanded, her voice shaking with a mix of heartbreak and fury. He was the one working to make sure you had everything you wanted, while you were out there taking everything from him. You lied to him, you used him, and now you're acting like you're the victim? Sophia didn't flinch. It's not like that, Grace, she said, a touch of impatience creeping into her voice. You don't get it. Mason couldn't even keep up with me anymore. I needed more than what he could give, and I found someone who could give it to me. Ryan understood me. He gave me what I wanted, what Mason never could. I couldn't keep living a lie. Grace stood there, stunned into silence for a moment. It was clear now that Sophia wasn't going to take any responsibility for what had happened. There would be no apologies, no admission of guilt. She wasn't sorry for what she had done. She wasn't sorry for the pain she had caused. The only thing Sophia seemed to care about was her own entitlement. You're unbelievable, Grace finally spat out, her voice filled with disbelief and disgust. You tore Mason apart, and now you're standing here, acting like you're the one who's been wronged. You didn't care about him. You didn't care about any of us. Sophia's expression remained unchanged, her eyes cold and defiant. Mason was too weak to understand what I needed, she repeated, as if it was some kind of mantra. Grace's hands clenched into fists. She didn't know how much more she could take. The anger was threatening to boil over, but she held herself back. There was no point in fighting with someone who couldn't even see their own wrongdoing. But Grace wasn't done. I will make sure everyone knows the truth. What you did to Mason, what you did to this family, it won't be buried. I will tell everyone. The world will know exactly who you are. Sophia just stared at her, unmoving. Do what you have to do, Grace. I don't care. Her words, cold as ice, were a final, sharp blow. And with that, Grace knew there was no more to say. The truth had been exposed, but it was clear that Sophia would never feel the weight of it the way Mason had. As Grace turned to leave, she felt a bitter mix of anger and sorrow. There would be no justice for Mason in the way she had hoped. But Grace promised herself, as she walked out of the door, that she would make sure Sophia never got away with it. Not in this lifetime. Not ever. Grace James thought she had uncovered everything: the affair, the financial manipulation, the callous indifference. She had confronted Sophia, had poured out every ounce of her anger and sorrow, and in her mind, she was ready to see this nightmare come to an end. But what she didn't know was that she was still missing a key piece of the puzzle, a piece that would send everything crashing down in a way she couldn't have possibly imagined. It all started with a phone call, one that Grace would later wish she'd never answered. It was from one of Mason's old friends, a guy named Evan who had worked with Mason at the auto shop. He had stayed in touch with Grace after Mason's passing, always offering his support. But this call wasn't like the others. Evan's voice on the other end of the line was strained, almost frantic. Grace, I don't know how to say this, but there's something you need to know. Something about the night Mason died. Grace's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know what to expect, but she sure as hell didn't expect what Evan was about to drop on her. What do you mean? What happened? She asked, her voice suddenly thick with concern. I know this sounds crazy, but I think Sophia planned Mason's death, Grace. It's the only thing that makes sense. At first, Grace thought she'd misunderstood. What are you talking about? Mason had a stroke, he collapsed at work. It wasn't a plan. But Evan was insistent. No, listen. I've been going through some old documents, and I found something. I think Sophia was working behind the scenes, pushing Mason to the edge. I don't know the whole story yet, but it doesn't sit right with me. Mason was in bad shape, but he wasn't the type to collapse out of nowhere. Something happened, and I think Sophia had a hand in it. Grace felt a sick feeling rise in her stomach. She knew that Mason had been under a lot of stress, but the idea that Sophia had been involved in anything more than just being neglectful seemed impossible. Or so she thought. She hung up with Evan, but his words kept replaying in her mind. Was he onto something? Could Sophia have been behind Mason's collapse? It was almost too much to comprehend. Determined to get answers, Grace went back to the one place she hadn't thoroughly searched yet: Mason's personal files. His financial records. They had been scattered in random folders at the back of his office drawer, and she'd only glanced at them before. But now, something told her there was more hidden in there than just bank statements and unpaid bills. Grace spent the next few hours combing through the documents, her heart racing as she pieced together the unsettling truths. First, she discovered that Mason had been carrying a life insurance policy that she hadn't known about, a policy that named Sophia as the sole beneficiary. But that wasn't the shocking part. The shocking part was that Sophia had secretly changed the policy just months before Mason's death, increasing the payout to a sum large enough for her to live off comfortably for years. But that wasn't all. The more Grace dug into Mason's medical records and phone history, the clearer the picture became. Sophia hadn't just been neglecting Mason's health, she had been actively pushing him past his limits. There were messages between her and Ryan Blake, plans to meet up while Mason was at work, but there were also messages that hinted at something darker. Sophia had been pushing Mason to work longer hours, refusing to help him when he was sick, and even isolating him from his family. And then Grace found the final piece. A document from Mason's doctor, one that had been filed under emergency in the personal files. The doctor's note mentioned that Mason had been experiencing severe exhaustion, extreme stress, and high blood pressure. He had been advised to take time off work, but it was clear that Sophia had been pressuring him to ignore the advice. It all started to make sense. Sophia had been playing a dangerous game, and Mason's death was just another part of her plan. It was almost as if she had been pushing him toward his breaking point, making sure he would collapse at work. And when he did, when Mason's health gave out, Sophia saw the opportunity to cash in. Her motives weren't just about money, though that was certainly a large part of it. She had been so desperate to escape the life she had built with Mason, so desperate to get away from him, that she was willing to do anything. The affair with Ryan Blake had been a symptom of that desperation, but the true depth of her manipulation was far worse than anyone could have imagined. Grace's hands trembled as she flipped through the final pages of Mason's records. It was clear now Sophia wasn't just cold-hearted. She had planned everything. The affair, the financial drain, the pushing of Mason to his limits, and ultimately, his death. She had orchestrated it all while wearing the mask of a grieving wife. Grace leaned back in the chair, her head spinning. How could she have missed this? How could she not have seen what was right in front of her? The woman who had once been her sister-in-law, the woman who had professed to love her brother, was a master manipulator and actor playing a part to get everything she wanted. But now, Grace had the truth. The full, horrifying truth. She had to make sure Sophia paid for what she had done. For Mason's sake. For the sake of their family. Grace stood up, determination setting in. She wasn't going to let Sophia get away with it. The truth was out, and now, the world would know. As she walked out of Mason's office, the weight of the discovery pressed down on her chest. There was still a long road ahead, one filled with confrontation, pain, and justice. But for the first time since Mason had died, Grace felt a sense of purpose. Sophia would be held accountable, and no one would forget what she had done. Grace stood frozen in the middle of Mason's old office, the weight of everything she had uncovered pressing down on her like a suffocating cloud. Her hands shook, the papers scattered around her telling a story of manipulation, betrayal, and murder. Mason, her brother, the man who had always been her rock, the one who had put family first, the one who had given everything he had, was gone. And the woman who had once been his wife had pulled the strings that led to his untimely death. Sophia was responsible for his pain, for his final moments of exhaustion, for the breakdown of everything he had worked so hard to build. But now Grace had a choice. She could expose Sophia, tear the veil off her lies, and make sure the world saw her for what she truly was, or she could walk away and let her go unpunished. The idea of letting Sophia walk free, of knowing that she'd continue to live her life as if nothing had ever happened, was something Grace couldn't fathom. Yet, part of her hesitated. Exposing Sophia would mean pulling the trigger on a war she wasn't sure she was prepared for. The emotional toll would be unbearable, and the backlash, the fight, the consequences of bringing Sophia down, would tear apart the already fragile fabric of their family. She thought about Mason. What would he have wanted? Would he have wanted his sister to fight for justice, to make sure his death wasn't swept under the rug? Of course, he would. Mason had been a man of integrity, always trying to protect the ones he loved, even if that meant sacrificing his own well-being. Grace knew that if Mason could speak now, he would tell her to fight. He would want her to make sure his death wasn't in vain, that the person responsible faced the consequences of their actions. And yet, the weight of the unknown still loomed over her. What would Sophia do if she found out Grace had everything? What lengths would she go to keep her secrets buried? Grace wasn't just dealing with a grieving widow, she was up against a woman who had shown, time and time again, that she was capable of anything. The thought of Sophia coming after her, of Sophia trying to destroy her or silence her, sent a chill down Grace's spine. Sophia had already shown her cold, calculating side. What if she'd go further? What if she'd stop at nothing to protect her lie? Grace closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She could feel the rage bubbling up inside her, the anger at Sophia for destroying everything: her family, her brother's life, his future, and now, Grace's own peace. But more than that, she felt something else, a fierce determination. She wasn't going to let Sophia get away with this. She wasn't going to let her slip back into the shadows like she always did, leaving a trail of destruction behind her. Mason had trusted Sophia. He had loved her. And she had betrayed him. Grace couldn't let that be the end of his story. She couldn't let it end with Sophia going free. With newfound resolve, Grace made her decision. She would expose Sophia. But it wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be quick. She needed to be smart. She needed to make sure that when the truth came to light, there would be no way for Sophia to escape it. No holes in the story, no way for her to worm her way out of the consequences. Grace had no illusions about what this meant. She wasn't just going after Sophia's reputation, she was going after her life. The truth she had uncovered about the life insurance policy, the affair, and the manipulation, it was all explosive. It would ruin Sophia. And Grace knew that Sophia would do anything to stop her from exposing it. But the decision was made. She couldn't live with herself if she didn't act now. She couldn't let Sophia destroy Mason's memory any more than she already had. Grace was going to make sure the world knew the truth. Meanwhile, across town, Sophia was feeling the pressure mounting. She had always been one step ahead, always a few moves ahead of everyone else. But now, with Grace onto her, her carefully built empire of lies was crumbling. Sophia hadn't missed the signs. She had noticed Grace's sudden withdrawal, the strange look in her eyes when they'd crossed paths. And now, Sophia knew that Grace knew. She could feel the storm coming, and she was determined to stop it before it consumed her. Sophia was no stranger to playing dirty. She had learned long ago that the world didn't care about fairness or justice, only power. And she had the power. Or so she thought. Her first instinct was to try and silence Grace. She thought about how easy it would be to get rid of the problem quietly, before anyone knew what was really going on. She had resources, connections. She could make Grace disappear, make the whole thing go away. No one would ever know. But then Sophia stopped herself. She couldn't be reckless. She knew how to manipulate people, how to twist the truth in her favor, but this wasn't something she could cover up with a few lies and a well-timed distraction. Grace was onto her, and Sophia couldn't risk losing everything she'd worked for. Instead, she started making plans, quietly and carefully. She would play the victim, just like she always had. She'd cry her fake tears, act heartbroken, and make sure that anyone who questioned her motives would think she was the one who had been wronged. She'd deny everything Grace had uncovered, twist the facts to suit her narrative, and make sure that no one believed a word Grace said. Sophia had been in control for so long, she wasn't about to let Grace take that away from her. Not without a fight. Grace had made her decision. And Sophia was making hers. The battle was just beginning, and neither of them was prepared for how far the other would go. The lies, the deceit, the betrayals, they were far from over. In fact, they were just getting started. As the story unfolds, we are left with a haunting question: how well do we really know the people closest to us? The people we love, the ones we trust the most, how much of their true selves are we missing? We spend years thinking we understand their every move, their every word, their every choice, but sometimes, the people closest to us are the ones capable of the deepest betrayals. Mason thought he was married to someone who cared for him, someone who would stand by him in his darkest times. But the truth, as we've seen, was far from that. Grace's journey through this painful revelation is a mirror of what many of us may face at some point in our lives, a moment where the people we love break the trust we thought was unbreakable. What Mason went through, how his health deteriorated under the weight of Sophia's manipulation, how he worked himself to the bone for someone who was plotting against him. It's a painful reminder that not everyone who smiles at you is on your side, The people closest to you might just have the biggest secrets hidden in plain sight. So, now we stand with Grace. With everything on the line, she's faced with the ultimate choice. Does she expose Sophia for the heartless woman she's become, or does she walk away, knowing that justice might never come? What do you think Grace should do? Should she risk everything, even her safety, to make sure Sophia pays for the betrayal? Or should she let it go, leaving Sophia to live in her web of lies and deceit? But here's the thing, this isn't the end. There's so much more that hasn't come to light yet. Sophia's not done, and Grace's journey is far from over. What will happen next? How far will Sophia go to protect her secrets? What lengths will Grace take to make sure Mason's death isn't in vain? The twists aren't over. In fact, they're only just beginning. What happens next will shake everything Grace thought she knew about family, loyalty, and revenge. The question remains, how much darkness is hiding beneath the surface of those we trust? And how much are we willing to lose in order to reveal the truth? If you've been hooked by this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the shocking twists coming up next. What do you think Grace should do, expose Sophia or let it go? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and let's talk about it. Have you ever been in a situation where trust was broken? Share your story, we'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for the next chapter in this shocking saga. You won't want to miss it.